This week on the agenda, Britain has a new Prime Minister. But what will Liz Truss's time at number 10 mean for the UK's position on the world stage? Britain now has its fourth Conservative Prime Minister in just 6 years. Liz Truss inherits from Boris Johnson an inbox filled with domestic crises, energy prices, inflation and industrial action. But as a former Foreign Secretary, she'll also want to make her mark on the global stage. What might that actually look like in a post-Brexit world? Well, with me now are Professor Amelia Hadfield, Dean International and Head of the Politics Department at the University of Surrey, and Samuel Zhiguang, Professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University. Great to see both of you again. Amelia, I'm going to start with you, because Liz Truss, she's known as a foreign policy hardliner. You know, geopolitics is really her thing. So where do you think she's going to flex those muscles first?
She's got a wide range of options, if I'm honest. You're right, she is an avowed Brexiteer. And she's already, I think, packed her cabinet with pretty pro-Brexit, even sort of ultras, if you like, and some right-wing colleagues. And I think what she's trying to say in terms of foreign policy messaging, is that Britain is determined to stand on its own 2 feet after the bruises of Brexit. There is some bridge building to be done, to be reconstructed with Europe. Britain has, I think, provided some decent leadership, quite credible leadership, and certainly a lot of humanitarian support as a result of the Ukraine war. And I think Truss is going to want to see that continue, certainly, as well as British leadership in NATO. The trickier territory, I think, for me, will be how Truss wants to approach the European Union, because, of course, the jury is still out at this point as to the degree of connectedness, if you like, that Britain really wants to put together in its foreign and security policy with the European Union. I think in the last couple of days, what we've seen are sort of suggestions that there may be a sort of good cop, bad cop approach between Truss on the one side and the European Union on the other. She's had 1 or 2 gaffes. She's had a misstep in trying to figure out whether Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is a friend or foe. That didn't go down particularly well, so we want to try to avoid those in the future. But von der Leyen, the Commission president, European Commission president, actually was very, very good, very, very receptive, and said that the EU and the UK are partners. So there's lots to play for.
You mentioned friend or foe, so I'm interested to think, Professor Ian, what do you think? Will we have a continuation of the Boris Johnson stance on Russia, on China and the rest of the world?
Short answer to that question is yes. I believe as much as Liz Truss wants to present herself as a younger Thatcher, she is actually more of a Boris Johnson plus than she would actually agree. So in this sense, we can see that the first phone call she made to a foreign leader after being elected as the leader of the Conservative Party was to Zelensky, and it shows her devotion to the idea that she will carry on what Boris Johnson has started. And traditionally, she's been very hardline against China. So I think China card would also be very important to her.
Amelia, if we look at this recent review of the UK's external goals, that talked about the UK's new freedom to pursue different economic and political approaches where it suits our interests. How do you think that's going to play into what Professor Yin was saying and what you were saying earlier about the EU?
I think there will be a transatlantic dimension to it, to be honest. So I'd be surprised if the United Kingdom, was any less cozy with the United States. So I think that'll be a key component. But I think there are good opportunities for Truss to look at rebuilding relations with the European Union. We need to remember that before she was foreign minister, she was trade minister. And I think she set her sights on trying to work those bilateral trades into the sort of post-Brexit framework, if you like. So I think whether it's Singapore or Malaysia, in the global south, if you like, or Australia, or whether it's the United States and Canada or the European Union, she has a basket of options here that she can really choose. And we need to remember, it's one thing to be, a pugnacious, punchy foreign minister and to be quite tough in remarks on China and Russia, but very, very different to be prime minister and to represent much more strategic national goals.
Do you think, though, Professor Yin, we're overestimating perhaps the UK's position, especially when it comes to trade with places like China? You know, they've got this global Britain agenda, the vision of restoring Britain's maritime greatness as a trading system. I mean, is China even interested?
Well, I will have to. I mean, fundamentally, I agree that what Amelia just said. The Anglo-American alliance is the most of the key component in Liz Truss arsenal. So, in this sense, I would say that China would play a less important role in her foreign policy, in her decision making, and in fact. China, particularly to China, sure, there is a willingness on both sides, particularly on China's side, to continue on this relationship, particularly the economic connection with UK. UK in the past years has always been the most important foreign investment place for China. But having said that, I think the political trend has turned, and there is very little wiggle room for Liz Truss and the existing Conservative Party leadership to actually do anything.
And Amelia, what about that wiggle room when it comes to the EU? Because that relationship between the UK and the European Union after Brexit still needs quite a lot of finessing. And you know, the stalemate on the Northern Ireland Protocol, fishing disputes, that's eroded the UK's capacity to cooperate to an extent with the EU on foreign and security policy. Where do you think Liz Truss is going to position herself?
You're right. I mean, there is definitely an impasse between the two sides. But if she wants a win, and a win that would make sense to both sides, I think trying to, warm up that relationship makes a lot of sense. I think there's two ways she can do it. One is the European Political Community Framework. This is a sort of broad idea that was outlined by French President Emmanuel Macron. And the idea, I think, is to pull together like-minded democracies. The first meeting that they will have of that is in October. And I think if an invitation is given to the UK and if it's received and she goes, either she goes or perhaps the new Foreign Minister, James Cleverly, goes, that would be a very good sign, I think, that Britain remains interested. And the second one, briefly, of course, is the re-examining the Northern Ireland bill that's currently making its way through the House of Commons. If that's stopped, and perhaps even if it's scrapped, I think the signal will be both to Belfast and Dublin on the one side and Brussels on the other, that the Truss government is interested in pressing the reset button and looking at it in a different way.
So, Professor Ian, what's the wider world take then on the UK and the EU's relationship post-Brexit? Does Liz Truss need to realise that countries like China are unlikely to do anything pro-UK that upsets the EU?
Well, I think from the China's perspective, it's as a general principle, we need to acknowledge that each countries would have to make their own foreign policy and decision-making based on realistic circumstances. So China is, of course, one of them. And in the past, China has always been very strong about non-interference and sort of non-alliances policy. So in this sense, I would not say that China would do anything to upset either side or to be very strongly pro one side. China has always considered UK as a very important partner, same as China considering EU as an important partner. I would speculate that in the future, even if there is some confrontation or tension between EU and the UK, China would not stand aside. The most concerning problem for China at the moment is how this UK Anglo-American alliances pans out.
And Amelia, she's been accused of being a little bit too glib in the past. You mentioned the clangor when it came to Macron, those final Conservative hustings. Macron's response was that Britain's considered a friend, sometimes despite grandstanding from their leaders. So what do you think it says about the kind of Prime Minister that she's going to be?
It's a good question. I think you do tend to get gaffes, particularly in the high pressure cooker that is a husting. So I wasn't completely surprised to see that. But as Prime Minister, it's really best to avoid that. that sort of thing. And upsetting one's sort of oldest bilateral partner and neighbor is not a great start. Equally, I mean, Macron knows as well as Truss that you can play to your domestic audience by being pretty robust, particularly when you're campaigning for election or re-election, and you know that it's going to be not very pleasantly reported on across the channel. But there will be pragmatism and an acceptance that, it's a different type of audience when they meet, and I hope it's quite soon. They certainly have a lot to talk about because the British-French relationship it's a real microcosm, if you like, of Britain's ability to translate its post-Brexit identity with the rest of the European Union. You've got a physical proximity, a teeny tiny amount of space across the English Channel, but across that space, you get trains, you get ferries, you get a huge amount of passenger traffic as well as commercial traffic, and you get, of course, migrant and asylum issues and dynamics. Both sides have really failed to get to grips with that. So Britain needs to work, I think, more proactively, if I can put it this way, with France. And in doing so, I think we'll probably demonstrate to the rest of the European Union that now, hopefully under the Truss government, relations with the European Union itself can be more favourably looked upon.
It's interesting you talk about identity, and I'd like to bring Professor Yin back in here because some might argue that the UK had it all, standing out amongst its EU partners for its wealth of foreign policy resources and connections, membership of key global organisations, London status as a financial centre, and world-class universities and media. Do you think that gave the UK international influence that maybe transcended its true economic and demographic weight?
I think it does in a way, because I personally studied in the UK for a long time, and I lived in the places where it used to be British colonies, and you can still see the so-called soft power influences existing over there. So in a sense, it is okay to say that UK's softer power transcends its real economic power, but I would be also very cautious in extending that sort of statement so conclusively, because the economic and cultural influences of the UK is part of the UK identity, and we can also see that the city still has its strong economic influences across the world. Whether or not we can call it UK or British influence is another question. However, they're still physically located in the UK. They're still extending their impact across the globe. People still recognizing that the British university, particularly those influential ones, are in a favorable fashion. So yeah.
Amelia, I see you nodding along to what he was saying there. Anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can, I'll probably tout the university that I work at, Surrey, which has really enjoyed, I think, along with many other British universities, very warm relations with lots of, China-based universities as well as others around the world. And I think the soft power point is a good one, because you get institutions, like the British Council, which are lovely connective tissues, if you like. They operate in China. They help support British universities in working up collaborative partnerships, finding those research connections, supporting mobility. So I think there continues to be a lot kind of off the high stakes political radar that will tick over very nicely between the two countries. And I think if I can just say, I mean, the European Union will continue to work pragmatically with China. It got very close to signing and finalizing a very, very comprehensive investment treaty. I think at this point it's something on the back burner, but it does demonstrate, I think, the will on either side that can exist, when there is a sense of aligned interests. So I could certainly see that. I'd like to say that higher education, I think, is one of Britain's best known sort of brands, if you like, along with things like the BBC. And it's a combination, isn't it, of soft power emblems, but the willingness to resort to some aspects of hard power and support in Ukraine or launching of the new AUKUS relationship with Australia and the United States. So it's always that balance.
You mentioned the war in Ukraine, and I'd like both of your views on this one. We'll start with you, Professor Ian. The conflict has reignited those Cold War conversations, hasn't it? Certainly about the nuclear race and the threat of nuclear war. Now, NATO's strategy rates Russia as the greatest and most immediate threat to the security of allies and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. The response is a massive rearmament effort. I mean, where do you think that the UK is in all of that?
I have to say, it's very saddening to see this kind of escalating the rhetorics on both sides. Sort of the Cold War mentality and the Cold War discourse has been quite influential, and sadly has been used by many of the party leaders on either side as a campaign tool. I would call it, this is a sad reality in a depoliticized world, whereas the parliamentary party has lost its true connection with its electorals, with its people. So henceforth, in order to win a campaign, they have to mobilize some sort of rhetoric that can gain their most support. Sadly, at the moment, it's the rhetoric of friends and foe. And I would also circle back to the previous question. This could jeopardize the willingness among the people, among the higher educations, among the general publics, the willingness to collaborate, to cooperate, to work together with each other, and be the voice of Cold War being too overwhelmingly heard in the public media is definitely a warning sign.
Amelia, a warning sign, a sad reality?
Yeah, I mean, the Ukraine crisis has really shaken up Europe. We've not seen this much volatility and threat, high level threat, really, since the end of the Second World War. We had a few blips in the Cold War, but this is the most serious situation ever. Britain has walked straight into it, obviously, and it's had to do so not being a member of the European Union, but being a very strong member of NATO. So I'm not surprised to see quite robust, quite sort of phlegmatic approaches here. We've seen, obviously, the sending over the export of hardware, of weapons, support with personnel, humanitarian support as well, a huge amount of monetary support. So that's sort of proactive money support, and then the sort of reactive sanctions as well. And of course, opening doors to various Ukrainian migrants who come as far as the United Kingdom. So it's been a kind of a full fat approach to supporting and trying to resuscitate. But beyond that, I mean, Professor Yin's right. We've got quite a dangerous sort of rhetoric now as to post Cold War, if you like, Europe, and the way in which Ukraine now is an absolute tinderbox with a high likelihood of getting much worse at any point. I really hope it doesn't, but I think at this point there are one or two big crises yet to come.
We'll take a short break there, but stay with us, as still to come here on the agenda, we'll ask whether Liz Truss might take a more independent approach to foreign relations in future.
Roger, making you loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and the crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Welcome back to the agenda. Still with me to consider the future of foreign policy under Britain's new Prime Minister Liz Truss are Professor Amelia Hadfield, Dean International and Head of the Politics Department at the University of Surrey, and Zhiguang, Professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University. I'd like to shift our conversation now to talking more about the relationship between the UK and China. Professor Yin, Liz Truss has made her stance on China pretty clear. She said that if China failed to play by global rules, it would cut short its rise as a superpower, and warned it should learn from the West's robust economic response to Russia's military action in Ukraine. What do you think is behind that aggressive approach?
Sadly, I think this is this rhetoric is the last thing I really want to see, because you can see that Liz Truss, before she was elected as the Conservative leader, has had this sort of rhetoric presenting to the public. And I was quite concerned that she was elected as the Conservative leader because of that. And if that turns out to be true, we could only expect that Liz Truss would escalate her rhetoric, her hostility against China as a way to mobilize people, going back to the good old friends of fold rhetoric and trying to win the next election by scaring people into choosing Conservative Party because there is an imminent threat coming from China, which is, of course, not true. And on the China side, I would also say that Liz Truss' understanding of China is far from China's own, or at least China's attempt to present its own image. First of all, China has never recognized itself being a superpower and has never wanted to be a superpower in the globe. China has always advocated the importance of cooperation and mutual respect. So in this sense, we could see that trying to pigeonhole China into a Cold War rhetoric of being one of the superpowers is really not helping to de-escalate the circumstance. On a more sort of optimistic front, I think the world, after that many crises, the world is ready to see an alternative understanding of the world order, a sort of understanding of the world not by whoever is the superpower makes the call, but try to understand the possibility that cooperation among the equals could really be the future to global prosperity. And we just need to have the willingness and the the intention, the willingness, and a pinch of hope to embrace that reality.
As Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss was sometimes scornful of the so-called special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, citing Britain's better trade relations with Canada, with Japan, with Mexico, as well as a dispute over steel tariffs with the US. As Prime Minister, is she going to see the United States as the UK's principal partner?
Yes, I think it is sort of incumbent on the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to use that sort of heritage, that North Atlantic heritage. Nobody wants to really set that aside. I just think there's perhaps more of a balance now than there ever was before. The push to recognize and continue to work with the European Union as well as the United States. But I'm to some extent, I'm saying this as a Canadian because I always try to make those links. The trade relations that you spoke of, and it's a really important point you raise. She cultivated a very muscular, very sort of robust approach and saying there's lots of other markets around the world, sunlit uplands. We can trade with anybody. Let's, even the Canadians. That's great. As a Canadian, great to hear. But now, when you are the Prime Minister, the idea of being able to be a buttress, be a support to one of the most long-standing foreign policy relationships that the United Kingdom has ever had is important. And not just that, I think ideologically, she's aligned with where Biden himself is in terms of nourishing and supporting democracies around the world, climate change obligations, human rights support, supporting, sub-Saharan African production of green hydrogen, for example. So their agendas are aligned. And also, I think, Biden, quite frankly, wants to see progress in the Northern Ireland spat and would prefer Britain move rather closer, I think, back towards Europe, if not necessarily the European Union.
And Professor Yin, post-Brexit, much was made of the UK's pivot towards the Indo-Pacific, the AUKUS Pact. Do you think that's going to continue to be a focal point?
Yes, I think it is very likely that UK will continue that sort of approach, but not because UK would want to carry on the so-called UK wants to be partner with China, wants to be the forefront, so having a good relation with China. But more importantly, this is actually carrying on the Anglo-American alliances agenda of pivoting more towards the Indo-Pacific. UK, in a sense that the strategic role played by the UK in this Anglo-American alliances is more towards the Europe side. But with the events unfolding, particularly the Ukrainian crisis at the moment, I think there is a joint tendency from both UK and the American side to pivot more towards the Indo-Pacific side with China at the focal center. We noticed that many of the G7 countries have pinpoint that China and India are the two most important obstacles for the sanction against Russia. If the G7 countries want the sanction to be successful, they would have to work their way into crushing China and the Indians' neutral stand in this conflict. Whereas to China, it is nearly impossible for China to give up its neutral stand in this in this crisis, because the neutrality is on one hand in China's best interest, but on the sort of more ideological front, neutrality has always been the China's sole principle in foreign policy making, and also it honestly it actually stands pretty well among the third world countries, other Afro-Asian countries. The non-alliances movement at this moment start to pick up its political momentum. It is important to notice that the influence of the Ukrainian crisis is not just upon Europe itself or G7, if we want to look at globally, but more importantly, it stirs up a different reaction among the Afro-Asian and Latin American countries towards a 1950s and 60s non-alliances momentum. And I think this embeds a glimpse of hope for a different sort of world order in the future.
Talking of a different world order, Amelia, do you see from an economic and security perspective, Britain may be pursuing more of a triangular approach, so Britain, the United States, Europe, in terms of foreign policy? Or do you think even a more independent approach might be the direction?
You know, Britain has always tried to be a bridge, a transatlantic bridge, really for decades, I think, between the United States on one side and Europe on the other. That heritage really goes back to the middle of the 19th century. And sometimes it's done incredibly pragmatically, you know, sort of Palmerston's, we have, you know, no friends, no enemies, just interests. And then sometimes it's done very ideologically. You know, we're deeply aligned, we have the same norms, we have the same values, we recognize Europe, we recognize America. We're part of both, in a sense. And it's been convenient for America to some extent to use Britain as a door, as a conduit to Europe, and similarly very helpful, I think, for the European Union to make use of Britain as an interlocutor back to the United States. So I can't see that falling away. That's such a key part of the British diplomatic heritage, and it gives them a continuing consistency, if you like, as to where they are in the post-Brexit world. But again, let's remember a lot of the global Britain ethos is still alive and well, and I can't believe that Prime Minister Truss is going to unpick that. So whether it's AUKUS or whether it's relationships with the Trans-Pacific Protocol, for example, in terms of economics, whether it's trade-based opportunities to refresh relations with South Africa. I think while there be this transatlantic triangle on the one side, trade will always continue to drive a much more globalist view on the other. And if that's overlaid with sort of security and hardware developments like AUKUS, I think that sort of suggests that Britain still feels it can kind of do lots of things at the same time. The big question mark over that at this point is if it's sliding into recession, you know, the purse strings are going to be tightened and difficult choices will have to be made.
Well, what a lively discussion. A pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you very much, Professor Amelia Hadfield and Professor Zhiguang.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda. After Europe's driest summer on record, how can the continent cope with an ongoing water crisis? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all of the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.